In my last video, I had presented a tool for members of Cellar Tracker with which to see if the wines in their cellars and their aging structures will in the future unleash an unforeseen tsunami of available wines, thus forcing them to consume too much or else to sell their wines or risk overaging them. Presently, the result sheet of that tool looks like this, and the obsessive viewer might notice that some numbers have changed since the last video because some days have passed. I opened 2 ports, bought a Madeira, and the pending bottle arrived. In order to understand this video about version 2 of this tool, you will likely have to view that other video about version 1 first. Both versions will be necessary to get a balanced estimate of the state of your cellar. This version 2 being slightly more paranoid but safe, with version 1 being more realistic in most cases, so I will build in both versions into my tool. After presenting version 1, one member of Cellar Tracker, presently going by the name of Claudipus, pointed out a problem with it, which would not have occurred to me since I habitually equate the beginning of a drinking window with the year of purchase. But many high-end wines have a beginning year way in the future, and version 1 of the drinking tempo forecast simply ignores the beginning of the drinking window. In the wake of having marinated in his objection, I noticed another problem by myself, and so here goes what these problems are. First, version 1 of the forecast prescribes a drinking tempo that is not at all affected by the wines, the drinking windows of which close after the year of maximum. And that is at once unrealistic and inconsistent with how the drinkability report works, because there the availabilities of bottles are immediately affected by wines with a later closing date, if the beginning date is already passed and there are enough bottles of it. Version 1 of the forecast therefore underestimates the actual drinking pressure in the years before the maximum and overestimates the availability of bottles after the maximum by ignoring later maturing wines for the imminent years and falsely expecting those wines to be completely confined to the far future. And remember, the initial idea behind the drinking tempo forecast was to check if there is a hidden danger of an alcoholic tsunami if you just trust and follow the drinkability report of Cellar Tracker. So it should incorporate the basic thrust of the drinkability report into its own predictions. Secondly, as per Claudipus's objection, version 1 of the forecast doesn't take into account the beginning of a wine's window, and therefore, in the case of wines with a beginning date in the far future, illicitly evens out the predictions for later years by impossibly spreading their drinkability to before the beginning date. This is a paradoxical movement to version 1's own opposing tendency to push consumption of ageable wines too far into the future, and the two effects should cancel each other out to a certain degree in practice. But there are possible cases of impending tsunamis years down the road that version 1 overlooks, but not version 2. Let's look at a purely fictitious example. Assume a person has only the following 2 wines in his cellar. Let's call them food stamp wine with 100 bottles and snob wine with 600 bottles. For purely cosmetic reasons, it just so happens that the drinking window of the snob wine opens just after that of the food stamp wine closes. That is not essential, but the important thing about this example is that the snob wine's drinking window opens only 10 years down the road. Furthermore, our cellar owner is not the youngest anymore and decides to close all remaining drinking windows in 2030 because he expects to die or to lose interest in wine around that time. This leaves the snob wine only 6 years for 600 bottles, enforcing a drinking velocity of 100 bottles per year. 2 bottles per week for 6 years may not seem like too much for some of the viewers, but it can be too much for some people over health concerns or other aspects. At any rate, our elderly owner draws the line at 1 bottle per week. That is roughly 4 bottles a month, for whatever reason, and thus the velocity of 100 bottles per year constitutes a tsunami hitting him starting in 2025. And this is what the drinking tempo forecast warning him of the tsunami should realistically look like. So it shows the arriving tsunami, but version 1 of his forecast in fact looks like this. promising him a moderate drinking tempo until the very exhaustion of his cellar of less than 4 bottles a month, and thus under his limit. And of course, that error is an artifact of version 1 having ignored the fact that the snob wine is not available until 2025. Now, granted, this example is extremely artificial, but many cellars are in fact dominated by late-ready wines, and due to their far greater complexity, they are pregnant with less obvious future tsunamis that version 1 would not disclose, by assuming that the owner would be willing to waste the potential quality of some of their wines by drinking them too early. So, version 2 that follows from now on serves mainly 2 purposes. First, it is a safety check for such late tsunamis due to late opening wines after having checked version 1. Secondly, it reflects the behavior of the linear model performance of the drinkability report of Cellar Tracker more closely, so its graph somewhat represents the actual drinking velocity for each year as it will occur through time, if you follow the drinkability report's availabilities, while in version 1, the only part of the graph that indicates an actual drinking velocity is the maximum, equally for the whole time until it arrives. So version 1 is more akin to what happens if you just look at your cellar, order by the end year, and drink at the presently required drinking tempo those wines ending before or in the year of maximum, kicking the can of later ending wines down the road. But the following version 2 does not substitute version 1 completely, because it has other problems connected with it that I will mention later. So now let's produce version 2 of the drinking tempo forecast. Just like with version 1, I export the same data from my cellar, except that I also include the column drink starting, which contains my beginning years of the drinking windows for my wines. Hit export again, and now the exported data contains the field begin consume, holding the beginning year, which can be 9,999, signifying that no beginning year was ascribed. I copy this whole shebang into the same table I prepared for version 1, only that I have to add a new column for the beginning years of the drinking windows. I just move the column containing the end years over to the right so that my version 1 of the forecast remains unaffected if the reference to that ending year is moved, in my case, from column P to column Q. So I can now base both versions of the forecast on the same new table within the same workbook. Next, I redefine the beginning year, calling it begin consume underline new or whatever, as follows. If the beginning year is greater than the end year, and that can only be the case if it is the code 9,999 for not given, or if it is before that is smaller than the current year, then in both of these cases I redefine the beginning as the current year, because if a drinking window is already open, then it doesn't matter for the purposes of this forecast what form that takes. Otherwise, that is, if the beginning is anywhere from now until the ending year, then it just remains what it was before. In my case, this setup is a bit boring, since it presently results in all my beginning years being the current year. The formula here contained a reference to the cell V2, so I'll quickly explain these cells in columns U to Y. U contains the date value of today, V equals the year of today, W equals the date value of December the 31st of that current year, X contains the difference between W and U, that is the number of days remaining in the current year, and finally Y is the number of those remaining days divided by the total number of days in the current year, in other words, the fraction describing the number of years remaining in this current year, so to speak. Here, by the way, I took my obsession with precision to the next level and no longer rely on that being 365 days, but calculate the number of days as the difference between the date values of December 31st and January 1st of the current year plus 1, which in leap years will amount to 366. From now on, when I speak of the beginning year of the drinking window, it will refer to this begin consume underline new. With those auxiliary cells in columns U to Y, it's now pretty straightforward to calculate the duration of the drinking window of a wine in years, which is of course the difference between the end year and the beginning year plus whatever fraction is left of the beginning year, which in case of a window opening in the future is equal to 1, and in the other case of the current year is the mentioned fraction in column Y. And now we are getting to the heart of the matter, which are the two columns under Contribution, Beitrag in German, which both denote the number of bottles this wine arithmetically contributes, namely to the current year under Contribution 1 and to each full year within the drinking window under Contribution 2. This column, Contribution 2, therefore pretty much reflects what used to be the drinking tempo of bottles per year of this particular wine, except that it now doesn't necessarily start right away, but at the beginning of the drinking window. Basically, the simple idea of version 2 of the drinking tempo forecast is for every year, starting with the current year, to add up the contributions of all wines, the drinking windows of which contain that year. And we will see in a minute how this will result in a slight exaggeration of the impatience of the drinkability report. Generating these contributions is easy. In Contribution 1, I calculate what fraction of the duration of this wine's window falls into the current year. So I divide the decimal portion of the duration minus its own integer, by the total duration. Then multiply the result with the number of bottles of that wine in my cellar in the column J. Contribution 2, unless the ending year equals the present year, in which case it will be 0, is simply that same number of bottles divided by the total duration of the drinking window. And this way, the number of bottles for each wine in the cellar is now partitioned and equally distributed across its drinking window, according to a linear consumption formula. You might have noticed, by the way, that some of the numbers concerning the date on the top right had changed intermittently because I had to insert a correction to this consumption 2 a day later. Before we now go on to generate the actual drinking tempo forecast version 2 based on this table, let me quickly demonstrate that it also works for later opening windows, and to that end I simply changed the beginning year of my 2010 Gigal Coturon to 2018. And as you can see, the contribution to the current year disappears, and the number of bottles contributed to the other years in its window, which then are 2018 and 2019, is 6.5 bottles each, which corresponds precisely to the 13 bottles I have. And this is finally what version 2 of the drinking tempo forecast presently looks like for me, and I generate it with the following table. For the current year, I summarize all contributions of the type 1 and divide by the fraction remaining of the current year. Therefore, in the case of the current year, the drinking velocity is not equal to the number of bottles. In this case, it contributes 5 bottles for this year, but since the end of the year is nearing, that constitutes a drinking velocity of 40.2 bottles per year until the end of this year. For all the other years, the velocity equals the number of contributed bottles, and I have to use the SUMIF function again. It summarizes all contributions of the type 2 in the column T of the source table, under the conditions that the year in column A here be enclosed between the beginning and the end year in columns P and Q of the source table, and that its type be of the type wine in column C of the source table as described in version 1 of the forecast. In this case, the SUMIF function requires a slightly more advanced level of Excel voodoo, because if the comparison to the reference cell is not one of equality, then the operators of comparison naturally have to be explicitly inserted, but for some strange reason in quotation marks, whereas the cell reference itself cannot be in quotation marks, and there has to be this Latin @ sign in between. Don't ask me why they had to do it that way. It took me some digging as well to find that out, but it works now. Again, the maximum drinking tempo is simply the maximum of the drinking tempos in column B of this table, divided by the number of months in a year, which in my case presently results in a surprising 3.4 bottles a month, when version 1 is presently promising I have to drink only 1.7 bottles. We will get to this in a second. Again, adding up the numbers of bottles here, which in the case of the current year is the product of the velocity and the fraction remaining of this year, together with the counting of the spirits in the other sheet of version 1, yields the total number of bottles as control, and luckily it renders it just as it is in my cellar presently, namely 222 bottles, telling me the universe is in order, although this sum if s function in version 2 seems to produce a rounding error which I have hidden by simply formatting the result to be integer, and that's very annoying, but I guess it's Microsoft. How then are we going to interpret the sharp discrepancy between versions 1 and 2 in their suggested drinking velocities? The higher drinking tempo of version 2 for the nearer future in my case is partly the result of all my wines, including those with the drinking window closing after the year of maximum of version 1, immediately contributing to the drinking pressure, similar to how they would to the availabilities of the drinkability report. Version 1, as explained at the beginning of the video, protects the time before the maximum from the pressure of such wines. But this shouldn't bring us to despair too quickly, because version 2 exaggerates that pressure through available bottles, and a realistic performance of the drinkability report would look much more like the red graph here, which in fact are partially checked with the drinkability reports for some future dates. The extremely positive skew of version 2 would in the real performance of the drinkability report be more moderate and the drinking pressure far lower. Here it would maximally probably be around 2.7 instead of 3.4 bottles a month. I can see at least two reasons for that. One reason version 2 of the drinking tempo forecast is even more impatient than the drinkability report lies in the fact that the latter takes into account the already consumed bottles, as well as the drinking windows for their entire length stretching to before the current year. And since I, like most people, tend to use up the bottles of a particular wine faster than the drinkability report suggests, then the effect is that the drinkability report will slow the availabilities of the remaining bottles of those wines down. In contrast, this version 2 of the forecast predicts the drinking velocity with all drinking windows opening in the current year or in the future, and as if we had a virgin cellar and no bottles of any of the remaining wines had ever been taken from it. This effect could be the reverse, such that version 2 of the forecast would actually underestimate the initial pressure of the drinkability report if there is a lot of pressure in your cellar from wines you haven't drunk enough because you had previously procrastinated your drinking duties, according to the drinkability report. That would then be a flood that you're already in the middle of, according to the drinkability report, and you wouldn't need this tool to warn you. Moreover, this would then be a case of a tsunami influenced by wines with an already open drinking window, and those would be discovered by version 1 of the forecast. But most people use up their bottles faster than the drinkability report tells them to. For them, the drinkability report will make slightly more bottles available to them in each of the later years than version 2 predicts, because it makes less bottles available in the imminent years. This difference could compound, in rare cases, with a wave of later opening wines in such a way that those would not in themselves constitute a tsunami, but together with a slight underestimation of this version 2 in the later years would add up to overlook that the real availabilities will be just over the limit towards a tsunami when the window for those later beginning wines opens. As far as I can see, that is the only case of a tsunami not disclosed even by a combination of version 2 and 1, and would in all practical cases not be very far above one's limit. The other reason for the relative impatience of version 2 of the forecast is this. The way the drinkability report makes a wine available is when the wine in itself reaches a contribution of at least 1 or the next integer. In contrast, version 2 of the forecast produces purely arithmetical availabilities greater than 1 or the next integer, compounded by adding up the contributions of different wines, each of which are less than 1 or the next integer. In this way, version 2 of the forecast signals drinking pressure prematurely, which in the drinkability report will arise later and more spread out over time. The following are some of the main practical applications of the drinking tempo forecast. First, disclosure of potential consumption tsunamis based on the present state of your cellar with no further buying. Second, getting estimates of the drinking velocities in the years to come based on the present state of your cellar with no further buying. Third, greater insight into optimal buying strategies for your cellar by filling in the valleys of either version of the forecast in case the drinking velocities are otherwise easily drinkable. Fourth, easier estimates of how much wine you will need until the end of your expected lifespan. In this way, it gives you a more and more precise upper estimate, way ahead, how much wine you will need, so that towards the end you can more and more invest in quality rather than quantity in an intelligent way. Fifth, in case of a tsunami, you can plan long ahead when you want to throw a high-class party. And the guests will never suspect that you are not really being generous, and that in truth, what you are really doing is taking the money you once put into those wines and investing it into their gratitude rather than facing the fact that you have wasted it. I'm sure this list is not exhaustive, and here's how I think you could put the first two applications into practice. Number 1. Looking for potential tsunamis. You first look at version 1 of the forecast. If it reveals a tsunami, then there is no way of getting around inviting your guests, or another way of getting rid of your wine, which includes losing it to death, to non-appreciating heirs, or to a loss of quality by overaging. If version 1 does not indicate a tsunami, then you can probably relax already. But just to make sure, you then check version 2. If it also doesn't show an excessive drinking velocity anywhere, then even if your velocities are close to your limit, there's hardly a realistic chance for a consumption tsunami, and even if there were to arise such a maverick one against all odds, it will not be so much higher than the velocities you see in the forecast, and therefore can be easily mastered as you go along by a couple of gifts here and there. Number 2. Gauging your drinking tempos. Here you go in reverse order. To get a sense of what your drinkability report will provide in the way of availabilities, you first look at version 2 of the drinking tempo forecast and, taking into account that this is a very crude approximation, assume that the real availabilities of the drinkability report will likely arise in the manner of the red graph. And to get a sense of how high the red graph's maximum will be, you then look at version 1. I think you can assume pretty safely that the red graph's maximum will be between the maxima of the two versions of the forecast. If the maximum of version 2 is intimidating, and there's no tsunami due to late opening wines, then you just follow the consumption strategy of version 1. Finally, and I don't follow that myself yet because you can never be sure, but I expect that we would all probably be well advised to close the windows for all of our wines within the next decade, because I believe that civilization as we know it will not survive much further, which for many members of Cellar Tracker would presumably be quite the game changer for their consumption. Cheers!